with you all today. And here's a little bit more information about the Food Research and Action Center, FRAC. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Andrew Shane. I couldn't be more excited to be Deputy Director for SNAP, working alongside Ellen Vollinger and the rest of the fantastic team at FRAC. Formerly, I was at the California Association of Food Banks for nearly 8 years, working in close partnership with FRAC and the Anti-Hunger Network. And a large part of my role in supporting Ellen on the SNAP team is to be network facing and to have the privilege to work with folks like Vicky and so many of you. I see some familiar faces and others I'm excited to get to know better attending this webinar. And so you saw my contact information on the beginning of the screen, and we'll have that at the end as well. Just really excited for you all to put me to work and let me know how FRAC can help support you. And we'll talk about some of those specific opportunities we're thinking about related to shelter costs later in this webinar. Next slide, please. So again, here we are today to talk about the SNAP shelter deduction and specifically the cap. It's a very important policy within SNAP, which I think probably needs no introduction, but SNAP is the most important anti-hunger program we have. And as we'll talk about in a second, there are key opportunities to fight hunger, improve benefit adequacy, and support families in need through this policy. And just a humongous shout out to Vicky Negus and the Mass Law Reform Institute for their excellent work, and Vicky for all of your time for today's presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit of table setting and context, and then I will get out of the way. Just a little bit on why we're here, why we're focused on this topic, why it matters. Obviously, this probably is preaching a bit to the choir, but just on top of everything else that families have faced, low-income people in America during the pandemic, we've seen extraordinary rising costs of living. Just looking up in some statistics in preparation for this, 20% rent increases in cities like Tampa and Boise that at least are not on my list. Obviously, I'm bringing some California bias. You know, the high cost of housing here is perennially a topic, but certainly stretching into communities across the country. And I saw a doubling of rents for a one-bedroom apartment in Phoenix. But what really stood out to me was that the Federal Reserve of New York expects a 10.1% increase in rents in 2022, their highest reading ever. So this is something that's not going away. And we know that this highlights the need for adequate benefits in SNAP, as well as other programs such as rental assistance. I think everyone's tracking the looming eviction wave that's likely to happen with the end of federal and state protections, and that families that you all are serving and supporting through legal aid, through food banks, through the type of policy work you're doing, we know that they're facing trade-offs between keeping roofs over their head, having food on the table, heating and eating. And as Vicky will explain, and I'm really appreciative of their research here, how this is an issue of racial justice and the cap's disproportionate harm on low-income communities of color who face even higher burdens of rents and other costs of living. And just a piece on the policy landscape, and we'll come back to this at the end. Right now with the emergency allotments, households are receiving the maximum, as well as with some of the waivers that states have taken advantage of. We know that cases are not being touched in the way that they might normally, and so all of the deductions may not be maximized right now, and that's going to be incredibly important whenever the end of the public health emergency happens federally, or when states are not able to take advantage of some of those policies, and there is a return. We don't want to see benefit cliffs. We want to mitigate those, and working those deductions is really important, as well as it's a long-term priority of FRAC, and I'm so pleased to take on this history with Ellen, working to remove the cap entirely, and we'll talk about some of the legislative opportunities. So with that, I just want to remind everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be looking at those. With that, I will turn it over to Vicky Negus. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much to FRAC for having me and for really, I think, leading the charge on talking about the harmful impact of the shelter cap and kind of what we can do as an anti-hunger community to really shift this moving forward. But so I wanted to kind of go through kind of an overview of why this matters so much for the low-income households that we work with. And so the way that we talk about this here is that we kind of start by thinking about how the shelter cap fits into the shelter deduction, sort of fits into the SNAP math, to really illustrate why it is such a critical and sort of punitive part and inequitable part of the SNAP math for families. So the monthly SNAP benefit that families get, I know many on this webinar know this already, but want to make sure that we all have the same basic understanding. Monthly SNAP benefits are based on net income. So income, families have a gross income, and then there are up to 6 deductions that reduce what that income looks like to get to net income. For 4 of those, households actually need to do something in order to get it set up on their case. And obviously today we're focused on the shelter cost piece of the puzzle. The other 3 that families need to actually affirmatively claim are medical costs, childcare costs, and certain types of child support that's paid. Next slide, please. So the reason that the shelter cap is so critical to do advocacy on and also kind of understand how it fits into the SNAP math is because it has a really kind of disproportionately strong impact on what the monthly benefit amount looks like. And that's because of the following. So first, what sort of makes up the shelter costs that are counted in the SNAP math. The first piece of it, the first chunk, is monthly rent that is due for families. We come across this a lot in Massachusetts. We're a really high cost of living state. It's the monthly rent that is due. It's not the amount that the family is actually able to pay out. It's the amount they're responsible to pay if they actually had the money to pay it. And then the second piece for folks who are homeowners is a set of home ownership costs. So their mortgage principal, property tax and insurance, if it's separate from their principal, a condo fee, those sort of discrete home ownership costs. And that shelter cost is combined with what the families or the household's utility costs look like. So in Massachusetts, along with about 45 other states, the way that utility costs are built into the shelter deduction is sort of through a standardized number that varies by state and varies based on the type of utility costs that are being claimed by the family, by the household. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so like I mentioned before, thinking about the shelter deduction as this 2-piece process, the actual costs for the building or the unit that the household is in, and then the utility costs attached to that. The impact of those costs on the benefit amount that goes on to the EBT card each month, it's not as simple as just A minus B minus C equals D. And because of how that SNAP math calculation works, the shelter costs have a disproportionately strong impact on the actual benefit amount that goes onto the card. And we sort of decided for today, we could have gotten into the weeds on why that is and how it works and what it looks like, but we sort of decided not to spare you all from that. And so if you want more details on what I mean when I say it has a disproportionately strong impact, you can take a look at, we have a set of SNAP calculators on our website, and those sort of walk through exactly how the shelter costs are sort of worked into what the SNAP math looks like. All right, next slide. Because we kind of want to move from what is the wonky policy to what does this really mean for families? So wanted to give a case example that we'll use through the rest of the kind of the overview to illustrate the impact of shelter costs on SNAP. So for this family's in Massachusetts, 2 parents, 1 child, their income from work is $1,500 a month. Their rent is $1,000, and they also have to pay for a heating bill. No one in their family is 60 plus, no one is disabled, and the parents don't have childcare costs for the kid. One of the parents is staying home to take care of the child. So if this family, when they applied for SNAP, if they did not have any shelter costs at all included on their SNAP case, their monthly benefit amount would be $351. If they were able to successfully claim their $1,000 rent plus their utility costs, their monthly SNAP would go up to $530 a month. And, I don't have to tell anyone on this call that much of a monthly food budget difference is really just massively significant for low-income families. That over a year is annualized to over $2,000 a year in food funds, which just cannot be understated how much of a difference that can make for a family. Next slide, please. So moving from sort of what is the shelter deduction, how does it work, what does it what does it include, to what the cap on the shelter deduction is, what it means, and who it harms. So current federal law really seriously limits how much certain types of households can claim for shelter by placing a cap on the amount of costs that actually impact the SNAP math. So before, when I said that the shelter deduction plays a disproportionately strong role in how many dollars go on the EBT card, the shelter cap serves to kind of diminish what that looks like and sort of artificially limit the impact of a household's real costs on how many SNAP dollars go on their card. That cap is currently, it's almost $600 a month. It's $597 a month. And it doesn't apply under federal law to households that include someone who is 60 or older, or a person with a disability under the rules for SNAP about who is considered to be disabled. Next slide, please. So because of that cap and the fact that it doesn't apply to older adults and persons with disabilities, the cap, as a consequence, mostly harms working families. That's because of who the cap applies to, and then also because families that have no or very low income generally get a higher SNAP benefit regardless of what their deductions look like. So the cap causes the SNAP benefit amount to be basically a mismatch with the real needs of many working families. So I have, work with families all the time who say to me, like, this just is not enough to put food on the table for the rest of my month. And I often have to say to them, I get it. Like, the way that your life looks and the way that money is going in and out of your budget doesn't mirror the reality of how the SNAP math works. And that is a significant challenge for folks, particularly in states where they're facing higher costs of living. Next slide, please. So to kind of go with the same example that we were looking at before and play out what the actual shelter cost, what the shelter deduction cap means for that particular family. So as I said before, if they claim their shelter costs, they end up with $530 a month in SNAP. However, that's with the cap in place. If the shelter cap wasn't in place, they would get $658 a month in SNAP. And this is in kind of quote unquote normal times, right? Right now, families are seeing that increase in the benefit in states that still have the emergency allotment, the COVID sort of emergency plus up. But once that emergency allotment goes away for states who've stopped implementing it, or for states that will have to down the road, we'll see that families in this type of a situation will lose some really critical monthly food dollars. So for this family, without the cap, we have a monthly SNAP grant of $658. And again, before I said actually claiming shelter costs is about $2,000 a year in food dollars. And in this situation, that would, removing the cap would add about $1,500 to that annual food budget. Next slide, please. So before, Andrew mentioned at the start of the webinar, sort of why this shelter cap is one of the most inequitable pieces of the SNAP math. And it is we view it as a core racial justice issue. And the reason that we view it that way is because certainly in Massachusetts and nationally, rental costs for Black and Latino households are higher than costs for white households. And this has been, there are many studies that illustrate that cost burdens are higher for families of color than they are for white households. One example is linked in the slides, and that's the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies data. So they go through what rental burdens look like for different households across the country for each state and nationally. So that's a great resource to check out for your state if you want to just get like a quick sense of what those housing burdens look like across groups. Next slide, please. So we wanted to talk about kind of two sides of the shelter cap coin, for lack of a better phrase. So one piece of it is to focus on how you can make sure that your state is robustly allowing clients and households to claim shelter costs as easily and in its most simple way as possible. And then the other side is the work that we can all do to advocate to end the cap in its entirety. So on the sort of administrative advocacy side of things, like what can we do right now while we have this law in place? I would say that the number one goal is to try to simplify how families and low-income households can claim their shelter costs by making sure that your state allows a self-declaration of shelter costs. So many states still require proof of what those costs look like a lease, a utility bill, a piece of paper from the landlord. Those types of proof requirements are really extremely difficult for many low-income families to grapple with. Oftentimes folks are in a doubled up situation. They don't want to go to the landlord for proof. They don't have a utility bill that's in their name because they might have debt from utilities in the past. Overall, requiring that kind of proof causes red tape and adds administrative work for everyone, for clients and also for the state agency. States have the option to allow households to self-declare what their shelter costs look like. And I'll give it to Andrew in a second to share how that worked in California. But that I would say is like the number one thing to find out. This map on the slide is from a few years ago from USDA. And sort of, even though it's a few years out of date, it can be a good like launch point to just check out where your state is. Andrew, you want to share what California did?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So California, up until very recently, did not have the self-declaration policy in place. As many of you know, we also had been the only state to continue to have what was known as the SSI cash-out policy, in which SSI recipients were given $10 a month and ineligible for SNAP benefits. And so it's interesting that those households aren't subject to the cap. But at the same time, we wanted to, as Vicky's pointing out, it's just very important for all households to be able to simplify the process to claim the costs. And so we had legislation. Again, you don't need legislation necessarily in your state. This is more typical of the California experience. And so we had Assembly Bill 494 that was chaptered with an urgency clause to be in place in time for the SSI expansion to what we call CalFresh or SNAP households in California. And allowed for households to self-declare their shelter costs unless they were questionable. And this has been critical even before the pandemic for low-income households, knowing the challenges they may be going through and some of the housing situations they're in. But then even more so, right, with the pandemic, thinking about the stress and the uncertainty and the fluidity of people's lives, and to have a reasonable verification process. And so I linked to the legislation and the implementing letter, and I would just really point also to the administrators in California, the County Welfare Directors Association and the California Department of Social Services, who have been great partners in working with the advocates. And so it's just been a really wonderful partnership to maximize and make this deduction meaningful and accessible for eligible households. Thank you, Vicki.
Thanks, Andrew. And we'd be remiss but not saying that you can kind of kill two self-declaration birds with one stone, because self-declaration is also a state option for child and adult dependent care costs. So we definitely package them together in the way that we talk about this here, and think it's a powerful duo and simplifies a lot of things for a lot of families. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some other just quick advocacy ideas so that more people can maximize SNAP with their housing costs now as we move forward with the laws as we have them on the books right now. So first is trying to think about and learn about how many households actually do have shelter costs on record, and dig into that data if possible. If you're able to get that or talk with your state about that, that's always helpful to understand. And then the second is if it's checking into whether it's easy and straightforward for households to claim their shelter costs when they apply for SNAP or when they update the state SNAP agency during their recertification. So really just looking at what the forms that families have to go through, what the forms look like, what they say. Did they ask for the right things? Did they ask for the wrong things? Are they worded in plain language? And as part of that, thinking about whether your state's policy is sort of as expansive as it should be under the rules. So for example, years ago in Massachusetts, the state asked clients about mortgage principal costs, but didn't ask about property taxes. So making sure that kind of the full range of costs that families are incurring is asked about during the eligibility process. Next slide. So as a real quick example of what this looks like, in Massachusetts, this is our paper SNAP application, and just to show just the scope of what is asked about and making sure that that scope is as clear and accurate, but also as expansive as possible, so that households who are applying who have sort of a variety of costs don't miss having the impact of those costs fully allocated in their benefit amount. Okay, next slide. Thank you. All right, so with that, Andrew, I'm gonna put into the chat the link that someone asked about in terms of the deductible expenses mapping, but I'll let you take it from here while I do that.
Okay, great. And yeah, I saw some of those questions come in, but I just thought it made more sense to wait. So, but please continue to put those questions in the Q&A. Thanks for all the engagement, everyone. So just Vicky already mentioned some of these, but just to reinforce some opportunities for state action. And again, if there are appropriate places for FRAC to be supportive, we'd just be delighted to do that with you. Vicky mentioned the data earlier, but we always know that pairing data with stories is helpful, especially as families may be experiencing eviction, other pressures to document that harm from the high shelter costs and the cap. We know that is always compelling to really pull policy focus. Creating state fact sheets. So again, Vicky and her team have just done a fantastic job in creating a document that we'll link to in a moment. We would love to help support others to gather similar information in your state. Like Vicky mentioned, some of the data sets are national and have other state estimates. And we know that those quick and concise materials can be very helpful in communicating the issue to stakeholders. And then to consider, depending on what role you're in, the types of administrative advocacy on self-declaration or on other topics, potential legislation, right, to claim shelter costs. I know that's something that I have some experience with, and lots of others on this webinar probably do too. And again, would be glad to support folks if that's something that your state hasn't done. And I saw the question from Sarah Hasmer in the chat. There is a link in the deck to that USDA map, and I did some research, but I might not have found a more updated map. And so that's something that we could potentially help with to get the most updated list of states that have allowed for self-declaration. But similarly, for working on the shelter deduction, as well as the standard utility allowance that Vicky mentioned, there may be other areas that FRAC could be supportive, and please let myself or Ellen know. Next slide, please. Great. As Vicky mentioned, the goal here is really to lift the policy perspective. The policy goal is to lift the cap entirely, right? To undo the harm and allow households to claim their true costs. And I saw a great question from Kara Carter around where did the cap come from and the motivation. I can't claim to have the full history here, but it is the case that the cap has not always been in place. It has been lifted in the past. And so for anyone who's able to, we hope that you can encourage your members to co-sponsor the legislation, HR 4077, the Closing the Meal Gap Act by Representative Adams of North Carolina. There's companion legislation, S2192 in the Senate, that would take a number of actions to improve SNAP benefit adequacy and strengthen the program, but including to uncap the shelter deduction. And you see the graphic there on preventing households to have to choose between food and shelter. So that's a key policy priority for FRAC. And if you're able, and you can look up your members of Congress, I'm glad to support anyone to figure out who's co-sponsored that legislation, and asking your members to come on if you're able to take those kinds of actions. Next slide, please. Okay, great. Vicky, do you want to talk about some of your information?
Sure. That's my email. That's my Twitter handle. Folks are welcome to reach out anytime. We did link on here, and I know everyone will get the slides. We have sort of a 2-pager on what the shelter cap looks like in Massachusetts, with some sample cases, some sample SNAP math, and illustrating the point in the slides earlier about how the shelter cap is a real racial justice issue, and sort of why it's so inequitable for low-income families. So we have that written up on a 2-pager, and we're happy to, share out a Word version of that if folks want to sort of adjust it for their state. So yeah, feel free to reach out. Don't hesitate.
Thank you. And similarly, there's some of my information, and I just wanted to lift up a series of FRAC chats that Ellen Bollinger has done on and related to the shelter deduction and other SNAP benefit adequacy issues and opportunities to take action. So with that, I think we want to go back and start to take on some of these questions. The first one, Vicky, I think it might be helpful to look at Sarah Hasmer's question on, is the 530 monthly SNAP benefit example with or without the shelter cap? Maybe you want to go back to your 2 slides with the math and just clarify that for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. The 500 and, I guess maybe I can't see that question. The $530 a month example was the example with the shelter cap. So it would be like today in Massachusetts, what that family would get if we didn't have emergency allotments in place. So that's their regular SNAP amount. And then the boost would be beyond the 530 would be if the cap was removed through legislation.
No, I mean, that's slide 11 in the deck that I have, at least, or the second slide that has the math. If you're able to go back to that, just so folks can maybe forward several. The second one that's got the math in the boxes. One more, maybe. There we go. Oh, back one.
Yeah, the one right there on the left. And Andrew, do you want to speak to, do you want me to speak to the question from Aaron around how it could be an administrative advocacy issue?
No, take it away, because we tend to do the legislation here. So
yeah, so removing the shelter cap in its entirety is a legislative issue, and I think a priority for a lot of us. In terms of the administrative advocacy, I think it in terms of the state option for state SNAP agencies, whether or not they choose to accept a self-declaration of what those costs look like from families. I think it depends on your state. It could go through the legislative process, but it also could be, a little bit more of a straightforward path from A to B and do direct advocacy with the SNAP agency. And, we don't have a lot of time here to go through different kind of approaches to that, but I know a lot of folks on this call, and FRAC and Andrew would be happy to consult on what that could look like, depending on what state you're in, and sort of who you have relationships with, and how interested your state might be in doing something like that. Because a lot of states have done it, I think it's relatively straightforward for states to understand the option and understand how to implement it. Because it's not like a novel thing. It's something that a lot of states have done and have had in place for a really, really long time. So yeah, I think that piece, and then just making sure as we move ahead and states start to lose the emergency allotment plus ups, making sure that folks who came in the front door for SNAP during the pandemic are able to robustly claim their shelter costs. Because if they came through the front door during this time of sort of unprecedented crisis and chaos for a lot of state SNAP agencies, those costs might not be accurate, up to date, or have been included in their sort of eligibility determination. So that's the other piece of this, is really making sure that everybody's SNAP is as high as it should be based on their situation as we move forward.
And just seeing that we've got some resident experts like Gina Cornea in Utah. So there's plenty of folks to network with following this on that administrative advocacy. Seeing a couple other questions in the Q&A. For housing burden, you were referring to the percent of rent on household budget, correct? Yes, that was a reference I was making about families with higher than 30% of their income for housing, for example. And as Vicky mentioned, some of the research really underscores the racial disparities of those burdens. Sorry, I've got too many windows open here with the Q&A in the chat. So Anya Rose asks, is there any movement in addition to removing the cap, address how SNAP only considers shelter costs in excess of half the household's net income after other deductions? Vicky, you kind of walked us through at the beginning how some of that SNAP math works. Do you want to speak to that? Otherwise, I think that's not something that I'm aware of that is under discussion.
I guess in my mind, I think I didn't hear the whole question, but I think the question was around sort of like how the SNAP costs are allocated in the SNAP math. I think right now, at least from where we are sitting in Massachusetts, and I defer to FRAC on sort of like the broader national scale, but from where we are, the shelter cap is the piece of the puzzle that has the biggest impact and harm on our working families in the state. So I guess from our focus, we're solely laser focused on the shelter cap, but there are certainly many other ways that the SNAP math is inequitable and doesn't reflect the reality of the world for low-income households. So I guess my quick answer is like, yes, there are a lot of ways that the math doesn't match reality. But I think from where we're at right now, we're really laser focused on the shelter cap itself.
Yeah, I appreciate the question too, Anya. We'll take that back. Sarah Hasmer asked about sign-on letters for HR 4077. So in the FRAC chats that we have linked to toward the end of the deck, and you can also just find on FRAC's website, there are action items to take through FRAC's Action Network, asking, you can either send messages yourself or asking your members of Congress to co-sponsor HR 4077, the Closing the Meal Gap Act, or certainly reach out to me, and I'm glad to work with folks in other ways. And certainly with the Anti-Hunger Policy Conference coming up in only so many weeks, I think we are all thinking about what are the right actions to uplift those bills. But for the time being, getting as many members of Congress to co-sponsor them is our priority, and we're glad to help support anyone to do that. Those discussions are underway at FRAC around how are we going to lift these up, especially as we will soon be in a farm bill cycle as well. Diane has a good question around shelter costs and the standard utility allowance. I think this is something that we'll follow up with you about, Diane. It's something that Vicky and I considered discussing today, but we just wanted to keep the focus on the shelter cap, but appreciate the question and we'll follow up with you. All right, well, with that, I just want to thank everyone for attending, all of the tremendous engagement in the Q&A and the chat. As FRAC Communications put in the, as Naomi put in the chat, we will be sharing out the deck and the recording to FRAC's YouTube channel. That's going to have the links in there, as well as the contact information for myself and Vicky. So thank you for your time today. Please follow up with us, and thanks for all you do. Appreciate it.